Well, welcome everyone very officially now to Annual Gathering 2024, which we are delighted to be able to hold on Zoom. I started to prepare some slides, and then I decided that we don't need more very small font for everyone to look at for a little while. And I just wanted to open our gathering first and foremost by saying a huge thank you. This gathering in its entirety would not be happening whether we were in person or here on Zoom without our board members. I am the only staff member of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship, although we do tend to kind of include Andrew as staff because he does a huge amount of our admin, especially financially. But our board, which we have many board members here with us tonight, does a huge amount of work and really put a ton of effort into this gathering, especially as I needed to take some time away for family needs this summer. So starting and opening with thanking you all for your efforts in this, but also all of you who are attending. We really think through our gathering themes every year based on just what we're hearing from you. Are the things that matter to you that you're wrestling with? So I know Ray earlier talked about climate change being a significant issue, and that is something we've been hearing from you and is some part of how we started to frame this gathering. The title of this gathering this year in 2024 is Living an Anabaptist Healthcare Ethic, Past, Present, and Future. We are celebrating 80 years of Mennonite Medical Association and Mennonite Nurses Association, who eventually formed together to become Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship. And in doing so, really thinking also about what the legacy, not just of the history on paper, but the legacy of community and the legacy of the ethic that these groups, Mennonite Medical Association and Mennonite Nurses Association, not just talked about, but lived over the years. And I'm even reflecting on what I heard just now we had a social gathering just before this session started, on the number of folks who said, well, I become a part of MMA because this person invited me to their house or invited me to a gathering, or I went to this gathering and I met people. So this idea that community is such a heart of who we are. We also are incredibly lucky to have Joe Kotva with us this weekend, who was a founder of AIC, or Anabaptist Center for Healthcare Ethics, which also became a part of MHF a number of years ago now. And so in thinking too about our history and the role of the Anabaptist Center for Healthcare Ethics, we really wanted to focus this gathering on this idea of what is an Anabaptist healthcare ethic, but also how do we live that ethic in our daily life, in our history, in our present, and in our future. And that's the core of the weekend. And we felt that the most important thing to start with then was to start by reviewing not the history just in terms of a timeline and dates, but a history as it was lived. And so we were incredibly excited to invite Paul Leichty back to do that. And we then wanted, in this same Friday night, to go ahead and start reflecting on this question of what is an Anabaptist healthcare ethic. And so Joe is then going to speak after Paul on this question of moving towards an Anabaptist healthcare ethic. What might it be? And we know that she'll be somewhat of an interactive session. So that's the plan for tonight. Tomorrow, first thing in the morning, at 9 o'clock, we have a session where you all are really welcome to come and both ask your questions of us as the board in terms of what is the future of MHF? This gathering is past, present, and future. What are we hoping to do in the future? But we also want to hear from you. What do you feel the future of MHF should hold? What do you feel are the core things we should be focusing on and the things that have mattered most to you? And we really would appreciate your time to join us for that and to share of your wisdom. And then we have our session on Anabaptist ethics and climate change with Joe, a break from lunch, and then we'll hear from Dodanim, who is the current chair of the Global Anabaptist Healthcare Network. In the last session, people raised their hands if they'd spent time overseas, and it was a good number of folks. But we also talked about developing regions in the US. I think that Mennonites have long been involved globally, and not just American and North American Mennonites being involved globally, but global Mennonites. We are a global family, and MHF, MMA, MMN have tended to be more North American, but that is really starting to spread out. So we look forward to hearing from Dodani. And then on Sunday, we are invited to a special session at North Baltimore Mennonite Church to hear from Jeannie Davis at the Anabaptist Disabilities Network, which again is even a deeper connection than that, as Paul also was a significant part of the Anabaptist Disabilities work for many, many years, simultaneously too, and after being MHF director. And so we really want to nurture that relationship as well, and thinking about how we are inclusive and how we, even as medical practitioners, the ways we approach folks with disabilities is an important part of an Anabaptist ethic. So that's kind of the overview of the whole weekend. We will start now with a few minutes to settle ourselves into worship. Kathy Shelley will be doing our worship leading, and I'll be doing a little bit of screen sharing to facilitate that. So Kathy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kate. I think, Kate, you're going to screen share for me the call to worship. I think everybody's muted, so keep yourself muted. Kate is going to screen share a call to worship, and I'll invite you to respond in the bold print where it says people, and I'll indicate by raising my hand when it's your turn, but keep yourself muted. It'll probably work a little better. This call to worship is from the new hymnal, Voices Together. And yes, let's begin. Jesus calls us to praise and prayer, to song and silence. Jesus calls us to worship. Jesus calls us to hearing and healing, to service and solidarity. Jesus calls us to love. Jesus calls us to advocacy and action, to protest and provision. Jesus calls us to justice. We hear the call of Christ. We worship together with joy. Please pray with me. Holy God, we thank you for this gathering, for the ones gathered here and there in our scattered places across the US and Canada, and also tomorrow in Guatemala. We remember those that 80 years ago started gathering to support each other, wanting to share and support each other in their faith and work connection. We pray, God, your blessing on our time together this weekend, in our remembering and reflecting, our learning together and growing in our understanding, in our connecting and reconnecting with one another. Be with us. May we in this time together be an encouragement to one another. May your presence in our time this weekend inspire us as we move forward to see more ways that we too, like those before us, can continue to connect our faith and our work in healthcare in all our communities and beyond. In your gracious name, amen. And if we were in person, we would pass the peace. We're going to do a sort of a virtual pass the peace in a moment. Friends, hear the words of Jesus. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. So would you share a pass the peace with one another by putting peace be with you in the chat, or you could do it to an individual or to the whole group. Peace be with you. And now Andrew is going to read our scripture passage for this evening.
I'm reading Hebrews 10, 24 through 25 from the NRSV. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I appreciate that that Hebrews passage. Let us not neglect meeting together. So we thank each and every one of you for being here and not neglecting to meet together. And we are going to go ahead and get set up for our very first session.
Wanda, not Wanda, Donna has a reading yet.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Can you all hear me?
Okay. Thank you, Donna.
I'd like to share a blessing on us called Evening Moment. Evening, cooler than in past days. The sky is quiet, polished purple, thickening with darkness, gently turning to octopus ink. A stand of trees, black against the horizon, shuffles vaguely, then stills. An eyelash of moon hovers over the horizon. It seems to be looking at you and me. Stars start humming their tiny, tinny tunes. The earth is not just there, but holding you up. With each breath, the evening air greets you, enters you, becomes you, and leaves in peace. A single bird note sounds, not a song, just a note, like one star, then silence. In the enfolding space, in the beckoning of the stillness, something in you stands up and speaks. And the earth and the trees and the sky and the very stars here and will remember forever. Amen. And I'll turn it back to you, Kate.
Thank you, Donna. Well, our first speaker is someone who I believe is truly familiar to most, if not all of you, and that is Paul Leichty. Paul has been working on really taking a deep look at the history of MMA, MNA, and Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship for a number of years. And so this presentation, I think, is a challenge to fit into 45 minutes because there's so much there. And of that, Paul has really taken time, not just to be able to tell you the facts, but to really tell a story. And so we're really grateful for the time you've spent on this and the time that you're here with us tonight, Paul. I will make sure that you can share your screen. And we will go ahead and get your slides up. Let me know if you need any help with that.
Okay, I think we've got it. I am very honored to be here with you tonight to share my thoughts on the history of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship and its two oldest predecessors, Mennonite Nurses Association, or MNA as I will refer to it, and Mennonite Medical Association, MMA. When I got this invitation,
I don't see your slides, just so you know. I'm not sure if you meant to share them yet.
Yeah, I did.
Just want to make sure.
Okay. Forgot to
There
hit
we
the
go.
share button.
There you go. We're very, very close. If you
All right,
navigate to your slides now.
now if I can get back to where I was. Yeah. Okay.
I still just see a picture of your screen, but I don't see the slides.
Okay. Let me go back.
Perfect. Now I see them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. When I received this invitation, I guess initially from Kathy, a bit of trivia reemerged as I considered accepting it. The last time I spoke in a plenary session of Annual Gathering was in 2018 at Bluffton University in Bluffton, Ohio. I realized at that point I was one of 7 persons on the program who were descendants or spouses of my wife Twyla's maternal grandparents, Bila and Mabel Bucher. Considering this year's recognition of the 80th anniversary of the founding of MNA and MMA, I decided to look further into the Bucher story. In a few minutes, I will tell you why. But another unique feature of the 2018 annual gathering also came to my mind, and that was the presence of several persons from the Plain community. These persons were present in 2018, and several more were present at Laurelville for the 2019 MHF Annual Gathering. So we begin our look at history, community, and ethics this evening with this story. In the last few years of my time as executive director of MHF, I became fascinated with a particular Facebook group called Anabaptists in Healthcare Professions. Who were these folks, I wondered? How did they suddenly attract hundreds of members? Wasn't it for Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship to build a network of Anabaptists in healthcare professions? How did I not know about this? Well, it turned out that this was a Facebook group whose primary audience was the so-called plain people who were entering the healthcare field. These were folks who were claiming the Anabaptist label for a culturally conservative Mennonite and Brethren movement that was somewhere between the Old Order Amish and Mennonite groups on the one hand, and the folks from Mennonite Church USA and its splinter groups on the other hand. These folks from the Plain community were in the process of moving from their tight-knit church communities with their emphasis on separation from the world into the professional world of greater engagement with surrounding society. As I started talking to some of these folks, I discovered that they not only had a Facebook group, but they also had their own conference where scores of them gathered for worship, speakers, and workshops. The Facebook group and conference were ways for them to discuss 2 primary tensions in their movement. On the one hand, were the issues of how to explain their entrance into higher education and healthcare professions to their more culturally conservative parents and church leaders. On the other hand, were the challenges of navigating in a secular world where the values and ethics they had grown up with were constantly being challenged. I was particularly intrigued because the tensions they were experiencing appeared to me to be much the same as those faced several generations ago among what are now mainstream Mennonites. And that leads us to the beginnings of MNA and MMA. 80 years ago, Mennonites in North America were dealing with the effects of a second Great World War. During the First World War, earlier in the century, Mennonites were largely unprepared to face the tensions of being a peace people in a time of global war. So following World War I in the 1920s and 30s, Mennonites in the US joined with other peace churches to negotiate a plan for the government to recognize conscientious objection and an alternative to military combat. In doing this, Mennonite church leaders needed to convince the US government that they were ready to emerge, albeit cautiously, from their isolationist and separatist stance and become useful citizens of their country. They just could not go to war. So in the process of this next level of interaction with the larger society, Mennonites in the US during the World War II era were grappling with many of the same larger tensions faced by the plain people of today. In Volume 4 of the historical series, The Mennonite Experience in America, titled Mennonites in American Society, 1930 to 1970, Paul Taves, the historian from California, uses the subtitle Modernity and the Persistence of Religious Community to describe this era. How does a people for whom separation from the world has been a part of their DNA for centuries now respond to modernity, modern life in America? What are the ethical commitments that are tested in that transition? What are the tensions, the changes of emphases, the new phases of life that emerge from that tension? Perhaps more importantly, how does the definition of community change in that transition? So chapter 8 of Taves' book intrigued me a lot because it's entitled Balancing Separation and Engagement. Mennonites who felt called to healthcare professions participated fully in that balancing act from separation to engagement from 1930 to 1970, just as the plain people do today. The question was this: is community defined as a separation from the world? In other words, my family, members of my congregation, knit together by a faith commitment in our relatively small rural communities? If so, the primary ethic is one of purity of the faith, or at least the faith tradition as it has been passed on. It is an ethic of non-conformity to the world, but yet in some ways a conformity to the church community and obedience to its leaders, who in that era were mostly called bishops. Or these folks were asking in that era, is there another definition of community in which our faith and our ethical commitments permit and maybe even require our engagement with the larger world around us, even though that world does not share our faith commitments? So this is a story of the new balance in the Mennonite community as young adults moved into healthcare professions. It's the story of how in their engagement with the larger world, they moved first into mittens and then into associations. Along the way, we will observe the themes and the ethical emphases that accompanied these changes. That is what first led to the formation of Mennonite Nurses Association and then Mennonite Medical Association in the 1940s, and eventually then to the formation of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship in 2011. Now, before going too far, we need to note that the storyline that we're following is largely that of the Swiss and South German wing of Anabaptism, the story of Mennonites and Amish Mennonites who first came to America starting in 1683. In my own personal history, this is my father's side of the family, even though our immediate ancestors didn't arrive in America until the middle of the 19th century. But my father's ancestors migrated first from Switzerland and Germany to the Alsace region, what is now France, but which was German at that point. This is where the Amish schism, with its emphasis on separation, predominated. On the other hand, on my mother's side of the family is the other major wing of Anabaptism, from the Dutch North German area spreading into Russia and migrating to the Russian Empire, into the area we now know as Ukraine. These folks were called Russian Mennonites in my day, and my maternal ancestors were among the first wave of migration to North America starting in the mid-1870s. So in turn, my father's tradition was called the Old Mennonites, and that's not to be confused with the Old Order Mennonites back in the East. These were just the Old Mennonites. Old Mennonites included Amish Mennonites who didn't observe the Old Order, but gradually then merged with Mennonites who had never been Amish. So that's how you got the old Mennonites. In many ways, the old Mennonites were viewed by the more recently arrived Russian Mennonites and others the way plain groups are viewed by many mainstream Mennonites today. So in general, Mennonites who stayed, excuse me, in Europe longer engaged sooner with the larger society and acculturated faster to that society, even before coming to North America. So, for instance, by the early 20th century, the descendants of this Northern European group had decades and even centuries of involvement in healthcare professions. There are numerous examples of Dutch Mennonite doctors in the 17th and 18th centuries, many of whom were also pastoral leaders in their congregations. There are also examples of Mennonites in Ukraine starting healthcare institutions to care for their own people with chronic illness, disabilities, and mental illness. Thus, Mennonites who migrated later from Europe viewed their spiritual cousins already in America as somewhat quaint and backward. The Northern Europeans were already embracing higher education, moving into professions and starting healthcare institutions. Thus, Mennonites in Kansas, largely from the Russian Mennonite tradition, had already started a hospital and school of nursing in 1908, more than 30 years before anyone thought of a Mennonite Nurses Association. This was the Bethel Deaconess Hospital School of Nursing in Newton, Kansas. I took these photos of the old buildings in 2013 as I remembered my mother, who graduated from Bethel Deaconess in 1947 and became a registered nurse. But the story of Mennonite Nurses Association starts with the first school of nursing started by the old Mennonites, as far as I can tell. That was the La Junta Mennonite Hospital and Sanitarium School of Nursing, established in 1915 in La Junta, Colorado, and operated under the Mennonite Board of Missions and Charities based in Elkhart, Indiana. So that brings us to the next phase of Mennonite history and healthcare, which I label missions. You see, Bethel Deaconess served a strong Mennonite community, but La Junta was a mission hospital. It was operated by a mission board in an area not otherwise known for its Mennonite presence. Mission outreach was the context and the rationale for old Mennonites to move into a more professional and institutional approach to healthcare. By the early 20th century, more Mennonites were interested in joining other North American Protestants in this missions movement. As momentum built, Mennonite mission leaders realized that taking the gospel to new people groups meant also attending to their physical needs of those they were trying to reach, a more holistic approach. By the late 1930s, then, Mennonite nurses were already being sent by mission boards as missionaries into overseas settings. This fit well with the holistic ethic of service in the name of Christ. Now, service has always been a part of Mennonite community life, but now, spurred on by the missions movement, service went beyond just mutual aid to others in the local faith community. Nursing became an avenue of service to others outside of Mennonite communities. Nurses could be involved in mission settings, simply ministering Christ's healing love to those outside their home settings. At the same time, they could help create the context in which the evangelists and church planters could share the word from a Mennonite perspective. So each year, a mission board meetings were held in a Mennonite community in the US or Canada. Missionaries on furlough would share their stories, mission leaders would preach and call for support and involvement in missions. A revival atmosphere would animate people to greater faithfulness in reaching out with the gospel message. Among the attendees at mission board meetings were nurse missionaries on furlough or returning from their years of service. They were joined by stateside nurses, particularly those from La Junta Hospital and School of Nursing. other interested persons also joined these informal gatherings. So in the mission board meeting at Haven, Kansas in the spring of 1941, there was enough interest among this informal gathering of nurses to form a committee to make plans for a more formal organization of Mennonite nurses. The committee consisted of two persons, Maud Schwarzendruber and Verna Zimmerman, both registered nurses employed at La Junta Hospital. So the next year, in June 1942, a proposed constitution was presented and provisionally adopted at the mission board meetings in Kitchener, Ontario. This then marked the birth of Mennonite Nurses Association, the earliest predecessor of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship. By the next year, 1943, MNA had regional groups that had already been formed in southeastern Iowa, Colorado, and Harrisonburg, Virginia, and soon additional groups were formed in Harper, Kansas, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Franconia, Pennsylvania, Ontario, Canada, Goshen, Indiana, and Fulton County, Ohio. Meanwhile, missions was emerging as a prominent theme of engagement among Mennonites in the two oldest and largest settlements in southeast Pennsylvania. These were the two conferences known as Franconia, primarily in Bucks and Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and Lancaster Conference, starting in Lancaster County, but whose reach eventually extended to adjoining counties and even states. And now I might add even nations. Lancaster Conference began its mission board in 1914, calling it the Eastern Mennonite Board of Missions and Charities. Later, it was known as Eastern Mennonite Missions, and today simply EML. A personal note is that H. Raymond Charles, my wife Twyla's father, and the son-in-law of Bela and Mabel Bucher, who I will talk about in a minute, was president of the Eastern Board from 1956 until 1980. Now, as it happened, some members further east in Franconia Conference were serving in some of the home missions projects of the Eastern Board. And so Franconia Conference decided they should establish their own mission board, and they did so in 1917. 2 years later, that Franconia board established its own mission station in Norristown, the county seat of Montgomery County, just west of Philadelphia. This became First Mennonite Church of Norristown, and then Nueva Vida Norristown New Life Mennonite Church. And it was where I served as pastor from 1982 to 92. These two mission boards, while not the first, do link us to the story of MMA. And here's where I'll pick up the story of Bela and Mabel Bucher. Bela L. Bucher and Anna Mabel Musselman were married in 1914. They lived in York County, west of Lancaster County, a little bit further from the center of Mennonite community life, but still a part of it. They had 4 children. The oldest was Samuel Bucher, who was one of the founders and early leaders of Mennonite Medical Association. Bela was a pastor in Lancaster Conference, but pastors were still largely self-supported, and he didn't have a large farm. Thus, the family struggled to make ends meet. Mabel's brother, on the other hand, was one of 2 men sent by this Eastern Mission Board to search for a mission field in South America. So the family was very much interested in this emerging missions movement in their conference. Years later, Mabel wrote to her children and grandchildren after a rare long-distance phone call. A portion of the letter remains. I feel the Lord has answered my prayers better than I could hope. For from the time you were babies, my prayer had been that you would all grow up to be fine Christians and workers in his kingdom. And then she addresses Samuel in particular. Samuel, you were our first child, and I had hoped so much that you would be a doctor, as I felt a Christian doctor's witness work would be so great. Then when you as a child couldn't stand the sight of blood, I thought God isn't answering my prayers. But indeed, Mabel's prayers were answered. And she made special efforts to market her garden produce to earn the extra money needed to send Samuel to Goshen College. Mabel continued her special fundraising to send Samuel's sister, Anna Lois, to Goshen College as well. And Anna Lois eventually returned to Pennsylvania, married Pastor and Bishop Raymond Charles, who was president of the Eastern Board, as I said, from 1956 to 80, and they were the parents of my wife, Twyla Charles. Samuel Bucher finished his degree at Goshen College and entered medical school at Temple University in Philadelphia. Years later, he wrote, "I entered medical school with much fear, the only Mennonite student. Parents worked very hard to cover the cost of this. Mother was very happy that I was going to help others in this profession. I got all my meals at a local restaurant and slept at a boarding house. Graduation was March 1943, and due to the war and gas rationing, I graduated from medical school in the morning, was married in the afternoon, and left for our honeymoon in the evening." He continues writing, "It was impossible to set up a medical practice during wartime, so I was glad to work in a local hospital where my wife, Margaret, was a staff nurse." So meanwhile, back at Samuel Bucher's alma mater, Goshen College, president of the college, S.C. Yoder, asked another Goshen College alumnus who went on to medical school to return to the college. This was Dr. H. Claire Amstutz. He and his wife, Florence, a nurse, did indeed return to Goshen, setting up both a campus health service and a private practice. What's notable for our story is in the fall of 1943, Claire Amstutz invited a group of pre-medical students for an informal time in his home. He saw this as a way of reversing the trend of Mennonite young people going into medicine and then leaving their Mennonite communities and the churches that had nurtured them as they began their lives as physicians. And so he encouraged these students, while they were still at college, to commit themselves to service in the Mennonite church. Claire and Florence modeled this kind of service as they, the very next year, started service in Puerto Rico at the end of World War II. Eventually, they returned to Goshen College after their 3 years in Puerto Rico. They eventually led the first study service term, or SST, unit to Honduras in 1968-69, a program that's been very influential in having Mennonites internationally involved. So we go back to Pennsylvania again. In Pennsylvania then, after this 1943 meeting with Claire Amstutz, Dr. Samuel Bucher, along with Dr. Paul Nace, had a similar goal as they made contact with an increasing number of Mennonite physicians and medical students in the Philadelphia area. On May 10th, 1944, they invited all Mennonite and Brethren in Christ doctors and medical students in the area to the Bucher home in Sellersville, Pennsylvania. In the history of MMA, Walter Schlabach reports this meeting in this way. He says, "After a spirited discussion and sharing of vision, the group unanimously agreed that an association should be formed. The express purpose was for the fellowship, mutual sharing, spiritual nurture, and financial assistance. The majority of the students came from communities where there was little understanding of the tensions these young people faced. There was enormous pressure on the students to achieve academically while maintaining their faith values in an environment that was materialistic and non-Christian. The group that gathered that evening chose the name Mennonite Medical Association, and appointed a committee that included Bucher and Nace to draft a constitution. And so on August 2nd, 1944, a second meeting was held at the Nace home this time, where the proposed constitution of MMA was read and adopted. 10 charter members signed the minute book. By the summer of the following year, 1945, the Mennonite Nurses Association, which had already organized an Eastern Pennsylvania chapter, invited these members of MMA to be their guests for an evening of fellowship. And thus began a long period of cooperation between these two associations, which eventually led to the formation of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship in 2011. While this formation of Mennonite Medical Association signals for us a new phase to the movement, which I label associations, it did not mean the end of the previous missions phase. And that fact is amply illustrated in the career of Dr. Samuel Bucher and his wife, Margaret, who the latter essentially gave up her career in nursing as their children came along. With their first child already born, the Buchers left their Mennonite roots in Pennsylvania and moved to West Virginia, where doctors were desperately needed and where Mennonite and Church of the Brethren mission activity was already taking root. While missions was the theme that first drove the movement from separation to engagement, it was not an aggressive evangelism, but rather the ethic of humble incarnational service that motivated the Buchers and many others. That baby who moved with her parents from Pennsylvania to West Virginia was Sarah Ellen Bucher, who married Herbert Myers, who was a member of Mennonite Medical Association and president of the association from 1985 to 87. Many of you met Herb and Sarah earlier in our call this evening. They were among the presenters at MHF Annual Gathering in 2018 that I mentioned earlier. And Sarah shared with me that while the Bucher family was accepted and loved in their community, the local people were sure that when Dr. Bucher's children would be ready for school, the doctor would leave so that his children would have a better educational and cultural opportunities than the small, rural West Virginia community offered. But instead, they stayed. All 4 children graduated from the local school where they attended all 12 grades in the same building. But it was only when Sarah's mother died and was buried in West Virginia that the family ceased to be outsiders in the eyes of the rural community. And after that premature death, Samuel Bucher eventually married a single nurse who had worked in his practice for over 30 years. And when Samuel Bucher died, he was also memorialized and buried in West Virginia. Bucher family members, including Samuel's second wife, continue to make rural West Virginia their home. So to review a little bit, thus far we've traced a movement of Mennonite relationships to professional healthcare in 3 overlapping phases, which define what it means to be in community. At the beginning of the 20th century, separation from the world still largely defined community. Mennonites worshiped, worked, and socialized in fairly tight-knit congregational and Mennonite community settings. Here, the predominant ethic of nonconformity to the world meant conformity and obedience to the norms of the church as regulated by the pastors and bishops. Conformity was expected to a simple, non-resistant, faith-based subculture, which minimized and regulated interaction with the outside world. Mutual aid was emphasized as community members assisted each other in times of crisis. Yet, the missions movement in Protestantism started to influence Mennonites, leading many Mennonites to engagement with the world on a deeper and more spiritual level. It started with things like Sunday school and urban outposts and the exploration of foreign missions. But as the needs of the world became evident, particularly during and after World War II, Mennonites resonated more and more with an ethic of service. Missions and service was a way of engaging the larger world, reaching out with God's love, or as the MCC slogan put it, in the name of Christ. It was also illustrative of a notion that Mennonites were different from both the secular society as well as the typical American churches. And it was that difference that led to the formation of Mennonite associations. Now, associations were nothing new in America, as you can see in this list. What is interesting, I think, about Mennonite associations are the reasons for those associations. Most of those reasons are not oriented to further engagement in the world. Rather, they are oriented to a new form of inward focus or separation. That is part of the balance between separation and engagement that Paul Taves talks about in his History of Mennonites of this era. So in other words, Mennonites, having now decided to engage with the world by attending secular graduate schools and training programs, having now decided to enter complex healthcare professions, and having also experienced some of the nationalistic and imperialistic overtones of the Protestant mission movements, associations now became the new way of protecting and promoting the basic ethic of Anabaptism and community from which these pioneer Mennonite healthcare workers came. It became a matter of faithfulness to their Mennonite faith in the midst of their new professional lives. So it's interesting to note the stated purposes of Mennonite Nurses Association were these: mutual support. And it's interesting, they added emotional, spiritual, and tangible were the words they used. Mentoring. So experienced mission nurses supporting other new nurses. And then networking, which is an interesting word that we'll come back to. But perhaps most significantly, I thought, was support for nurses who at that time were at increasing risk of being drafted into the U.S. Armed Services during World War II. Now, all of these reasons for forming Mennonite Nurses Association relate to the felt needs of MNA members themselves to retain their Mennonite understanding of Christian faith. And thus, the governing ethic was a mutual support and encouragement of the individual's spiritual and professional life. The only exception may have been this concern about the draft, but in the end, legislation was never enacted to draft nurses, so that matter became somewhat moot. On the other side, we see the reasons for Mennonite Medical Association were noted: fellowship, mutual sharing, spiritual nurture, and financial assistance. And again, I would note here that initially this financial assistance, I think, was an expression of mutual aid to those medical students in need. But as time went on, it was the funding of mission-related medical training overseas, what was called the student elective term with Mennonite Medical Association, which MHF has picked up. But overall, you can see the internal needs of MMA members were uppermost. Engagement with the world was now a given, but the question remained how to balance that engagement with a separation from the world to maintain faith and ethical integrity. So let's return again to this association model. It really seemed to work well for MNA and MMA for several decades. Both groups had medical mission emphases which appealed to an older mission vision, even as the nature of overseas mission was rapidly changing. And so as the emphasis on evangelism waned, the strength of the ethic of service and international vision promoted by the Mennonite colleges continued to inspire a vision for outreach through Christian service via medicine to those most in need. And during the same time, career in healthcare became more accepted and encouraged, and so Mennonites felt more self-confident and saw less need for a specific Mennonite professional association. And this cut two ways. On the one hand, more Mennonites joined the secular associations. But on the other hand, the Christian medical and dental associations is an example of organizations that offered attractive options to Mennonites who were more theologically aligned with the evangelical movement and who also wanted more continuing education that CMDA could offer. So as new healthcare specialties emerged, associations had to deal with who belonged to these associations. Could dentists join the MMA? How about physician assistants? For nurses, did there need to be a certain level of education for nurses? And then how about other Anabaptist groups, such as the Church of the Brethren? Did they belong in Mennonite Medical Association? So in addition to these questions, the changing role of nurses and their relationship with doctors put some strain on the relationships between MMA and MNA at joint conventions. Particularly, nurses who were not married to doctors started to distance themselves from MNA. Instead, they gravitated toward the professional education opportunities in nursing leadership that were offered increasingly at the Mennonite Health Assembly. With less felt need to join Mennonite healthcare associations by the early 21st century, both MNA and MMA were searching for new ways to attract new members. With a long tradition of joint conventions, publications, and programs, MNA and MMA talked to each other and explored a new future together. And the result was the formation of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship in 2011. The idea was to open up this new group to all Anabaptists of the many healthcare professions that were being developed during this era. The assumption was that the new openness to all healthcare professions and the emphasis on integrated healthcare would attract younger members to this integrated association. However, within 3 years of the formation of MHF in 2011, it was obvious that not all of the assumptions that projected a highly successful MHF were valid. The association model itself was giving way to something new. With the younger generation growing up with the internet as a way of rapidly communicating to folks near and far, it was easier and more exciting to build networks more closely tailored to one's preferences, whether they be professional, religious, social, or some combination of these and other criteria. And what was the point then of joining an association, paying membership fees, and attending far-off meetings when there were plenty of networking opportunities as close as your keyboard or the cell phone in your pocket? So networking has thus become the latest movement among Mennonites toward engagement with the world, moving away again from the more separatist model of associations. While networking is most often talked about in terms of individuals using cell phones and internet, even associations themselves started to build networks with the others who shared similar and overlapping interests around the key issues of the 21st century. I was recently reviewing the short history of MHF for an online encyclopedia entry that I hope to have published soon. I was struck with how much activity of MHF revolved around networking relationships. Clearly, this reflected the interests of those Anabaptist healthcare professionals who were joining MHF, who are far more eclectic and diverse, to say nothing of the interests of those who probably considered our association irrelevant. So anyway, networking became a key theme, and MHF built relationships with other groups. First of all, it was spurred on by the frequent question that MHF got about how we were different from Mennonite Health Services. And so MHF utilized the consulting services of MHS Consulting and eventually joined MHS Alliance as a member organization. Secondly, aware of MHF's roots, mainly in the Swiss and South German Anabaptism tradition that I talked about, MHF connected with the International Mennonite Health Association, which had its roots more in the Russian Mennonite tradition. Third, desiring to connect with students entering healthcare professions, MHF tried to build relationships with key faculty at Mennonite colleges, universities, and seminaries. In addition, MHF also helped keep alive the Anabaptist Center for Healthcare Ethics and the Mary Jean Yoder Memorial Endowment Fund. So in the process of this networking activity, MHF discovered individuals whose amazing professional careers outside of traditional Mennonite circles led to new, enriching relationships. I can only mention a few, but I think, for instance, of Nancy and Bob Martin, who opened up new possibilities to connect again with the Nazareth Hospital in Israel, where they had served earlier, and with the larger Nazareth Project, which set up a U.S. office. And then there's Ray Martin, who's also on this call, in his career work in international public health and community development, who led us to become involved with Christian Connections for International Health and a wider set of relationships. And Ray's philanthropy, along with the staff work of Beth Good and later Paul Shetler-Fast, connected MHF in a new way with MCC's more focused work on trauma and other international public health issues. And yet another of Ray's philanthropic endeavors, along with the vision of MHF's youngest board member, Lubov Slasheva, connected MHF to the emerging Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions that is now restructured to become Anabaptist Climate Collaborative. And again, as someone noted earlier, many of these threads have now come together for MHF, primarily a US and Canada-based organization, to become involved in the Global Anabaptist Health Network, which you'll hear more about as the weekend goes along. So in this balancing act between separation and engagement, noted by historian Paul Taves, the pendulum has swung again toward engagement, and it is happening via networking. But in this new balance, the themes and ethical emphases of the previous phases have not disappeared, but they have changed in subtle ways. And so I think from the separation phase, the ethic of obedience to a congregationally based spiritual authority has given way to the original Anabaptist call to discipleship. And even our notions of nonconformity, I think, are not so much anymore about outward cultural trappings such as clothing and entertainment and media tools, but it involves more of how we relate to the power structures of this world and how we use the power we've been given to empower others. From the missions phase, I've already noted the Anabaptist tendency to move away from aggressive evangelism to more of an emphasis on service and servanthood. Too often in the larger national scene, nationalism and neocolonialism has been promoted as almost synonymous with the reign of God. But as Anabaptists, we've emphasized a mission to love the whole world and to focus on humble service in the name of Christ that leads to a more authentic engagement with the world around us. And so I think networking results also in a recognition that the flow of resources goes both ways. We learn as we cross racial and ethnic and economic lines, and we also move from a paternalism to a partnership. Finally, I think there may be a place yet for associations. Associations can certainly remind us of our identity as a people of God, can remind us that beyond the labels or the common interests that healthcare professionals have, there is a discipleship ethic that binds us together. The current phase of networking can also be a reminder to be aware of our systems. It reminds us also that God's work does not always fit into our systems. The Holy Spirit is not confined to one denomination, to one culture, to one particular way of relating to each other, whether it be in a structure, a profession, or an association. But God is doing something new, and I think networking can remind us of that. An ethic of God's shalom will both define and empower the new community of God's Spirit under the lordship of Jesus Christ. God's mission can happen wherever associations are expanded into networks of God's people that are being built, shaped, formed, and reformed, and connected into the image of Christ. Thank you.
Paul, that had so many pieces that had me honestly on the edge of my seat. Thank you for, again, not just your work on this talk, but how you've really thought about the depth of this history and the ways that it shapes who we are today, and the connections, the web of connections of MHF. And these phases, I really, I love the way you framed this, and it's really food for thought. And it does, I think, walk us into this next piece of really looking at what is it to look towards an Anabaptist healthcare ethic, which is, of course, our next talk tonight.